Thank you, Yasamin. So we have a new and exciting approach to getting input into the development of our implementation strategy. We have heard that there are many stakeholders and experts that have given thought to the plans, programs, and pilots to begin implementing decarbonization in our region. So we want to gather these ideas, learn from the knowledge out there in the community and in other parts of the country and around the world so that we can focus on action. The format of this workshop, where we have flipped the roles such that the stakeholders present and the government listens, is a pilot of our own. So I hope that you will come along with us in this journey to explore new ways of public outreach. If this is successful, we would be building an online repository of ideas or an ideas bank with 5 to 7 minute presentations followed by questions from the moderator. That will be me today. So first up, we have a presentation from Dr. Nilmini Silvasen. Dr. Silvasen is an Associate Director and C. Hugh Friedman Fellow in Energy Law and Policy at the Energy Policy Initiative Center at the USD School of Law. She has over 20 years of professional experience and leads climate action planning work at the School of Law and particularly focuses on transportation and energy requirements and greenhouse gas implications of water use in our region. Dr. Silvasen, go ahead.
Thank you, Murtaza. We can go right to the next slide. Okay, so really what I'm going to talk about is sort of the academic approaches to transportation decarbonization, what we are seeing in the literature. Even though EPIC, we do not do original R&D, we do track what's going on in the literature. And to start with, I want to put the RDF chapters into context. We have 2 chapters in that relating to it, and that's chapter 3, which brings out the modeling approaches used, the differing modeling approaches used. One is the energy pathways modeling of primary energy supply and demand. And what it does is it provides the type of fuel shifts that are needed to meet the targets. And these are really used at the UN, at the US, state and regional levels. But it does not account for some sort of behaviors like speed or the impacts of gasoline prices or other modes of travel. And then there is the activity-based model, which is the ABM2 Plus that SANDAG uses. You probably have heard of it. It is a demand model, and it really is based on people's daily activities, when they occur, for how long, with whom, and the choices they can make and they would like to make at a very high level of spatial resolution. They also use empirical data through surveys or GPS data or cellular data, real-time data from the highway systems, data monitoring systems like PEMS or HPMS. And they base it on a transportation and land use network that really is based on what the cities have provided to the agency. And they do this for a chosen baseline year, and then they make projections for population and for jobs, housing, and VMT. And so it is from this model that the VMT for the climate action plans are obtained. So chapter 8 in the RDF deals with local policy opportunities. And really, we have to remember that CAPs kind of represent a snapshot in time of hopefully somewhat of the stakeholder perspectives or what they believe what local governments can do to regulate, incentivize, and educate the community on how to get GHG reduction, especially in transportation. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to slip into the discussions that are going on in the academic literature. The first one I want to just focus on in this one, it's talking about the supply and demand approaches to transportation decarbonization, and that basically, when we look at this, we're looking for both any type of transportation, really. Supply side technological solutions like EVs or shared autonomous vehicles or alternative engines and fuels. But also we're looking at the demand side. So mobility, demand for access, and then mode shift. And this particular representative paper that we sort of looked at talks about the methodological challenges. They call it a methodological challenge of how to reconcile these 2 approaches. And basically they say, how are we going to derive the full quantified pathways? Because these models are huge and they lack kind of flexibility. to consider the full set of decarbonization drivers. And especially important for policymaking is that this type of modeling doesn't really allow for much stakeholder participation. So there's a lack of that. So what the study does in this particular paper is that they develop what's called a quantitative, qualitative, iterative, participatory process framework to construct decarb pathways and scenarios. And they actually test it at the country level. So they test it with Japan, with the UK, with France, and in Mexico. And to give you an example, the paper discusses how mode shift, for example, is a consequence of infrastructure, land use, speed, safety, so that qualitatively you need to go out and ask these countries or these communities, which geography, urban, suburban, rural, what speed would you make a shift in mode? And qualitatively, we need to sort of combine the belief of people on quality of life and look at the households in particular geographical areas and which areas can consider reducing VMT, for example. So in their study, which they applied to those 4 countries I mentioned, Japan, for example, thought that it would be able to reduce VMT by 40% between 2010 and 2050. And that's something I think we have a very hard time achieving. But Mexico thought that they could only support like a 6% reduction in VMT. France, on the other hand, thought that they can make their urban and their suburban areas more compact and therefore be able to shift modes significantly. And also, they thought they would be able to shift mode from air travel for long distance leisure travel to rail and bus. So this means generally that this model showed that there are these variabilities depending on what people think they can do and so on, and that there needs to be like a greater understanding of social dynamics that underlie this mobility of passengers. And you need to complement those things to a technology-based approach. And different communities of stakeholders have quite different ideas about what our low carbon future should look like. So their conclusion is that we need a framework that can do this sort of qualitative or semi-quantitative framework that's understandable by all stakeholders, and that we should have comparable quantitative scenarios and ask public questions in the context of deep decarbonization. And there is no approach to do this in a transparent kind of way. It's still to be improved or to be done. Next slide, please. So the next discussion going on in the literature is a discussion on autonomous vehicles. So autonomous vehicles move people or cargo without human intervention. And although it's still in our infancy, we do have some experience with on-demand services right now. And some sources, for example, Navigant Consulting says that 75% of the new passenger vehicles will be automated by 2035 in the US. I don't quite believe that, but anyway, we do know about the demand for on-demand services, sort of like Lyft and Uber. We know that in both, and there's also something called Zipcar, which you probably know. So in both cases, customers don't have the headaches of ownership and things like parking, and that's what people like. And these services operate through a smartphone, including booking and paying and so on and so forth. But this particular paper we looked at related to autonomous vehicles talks about shared autonomous vehicles, SAVs. This is where, say, a company would own the vehicles, preferably e-vehicles. And this sort of structure can have major implications for car ownership, for congestion, for VMT, for safety, and of course, greenhouse gases, if they're all electric and they run on zero carbon electricity. So this particular paper that we chose talks about all the benefits of SAVs, and you can see that, they could drive more efficiently, they can come closer together, they can drive at the same speed, they can avoid traffic congestion, they can be used to accelerate the adoption of e-vehicles because you can do it as a fleet, and in particular, they can charge in alignment with renewable electricity generation. So what this study does is they also use an energy system optimization model that separates these SAVs from privately owned vehicles, even if these vehicles are electric. And they basically provide 10 scenarios that they have with and without carbon taxes and so on. And as the scenarios are all located in Texas, which right now has high wind energy possibilities, and they're expecting the PV supply to keep increasing and their costs to keep decreasing, so that PV will dominate the supply mix in 2050 and therefore also increase the value of charging during the day. So this then makes it very attractive for SAVs, where charging can be optimized, curtailment might be minimized of the PV, and battery capacity might even be reduced if these SAVs can provide flexible charging load. So the conclusion from this particular paper, and in all scenarios, is that SAVs, ESAVs, can save greenhouse gases even if they double VMT of the vehicles they replace. And so their recommendations or the implications of this is that policymakers should put in place the regulations and the infrastructure to support SAV expansion, especially in the short to medium term, because they can be a very powerful way to decarbonize quicker. Next slide, please. So the next area of discussion in the literature is about freight systems, and we don't talk about that all too much here, although we do have a lot of it here. And this paper, or the papers we looked at, are looking at a literature review of other studies, looking at systems dynamics models that are used to address freight decarbonization in many countries. And although they find that the models address really only a very limited number of strategies, and they're especially weak on how this change should take place over time because the freight systems are much more inert than the passenger vehicle system, still they make a couple of observations. So there are 4 sub-pathways in freight system decarb, and that is reducing demand. It's similar to the one for passenger vehicles, but reducing demand. And they found, what does that mean? It means you minimize the physical amount of goods to be delivered by making products last longer, recycle, digitize, and designing goods with less material and increasing the price. Those are ways to decrease demand. But they found that this is nearly impossible because there's a huge focus on consumption. And not only that, there's an increase in population, and the investments in road infrastructure help to maintain the levels of freight demand on the roads. And they also found that price increases in fuel really didn't make much of a difference to freight demand. So the second way of decarbonizing freight is to shift to lower carbon transportation modes. And in this case, it means shifting from road to electric rail. This is very good for other countries. You all know that we have a problem here in San Diego with our rail falling off the cliff here. That's the rail that brings us our freight, moves our freight. So rail is much more efficient than truck, so ship. And they suggest that you can use a carbon tax to move the freight mode, say from road to rail. The other area that can be used is to increase energy efficiency of the freight system, moving the same amount of freight with the same amount of infrastructure, or moving more goods with the same energy and infrastructure by optimizing loads among companies, asset sharing, sharing warehouses, and so on, improving driver behavior, renewing the fleet faster, and so on and so forth. And then finally, there is a way to do something with alternative fuels, although this is also still rather undeveloped. There is currently a DOE research program into using e-methanol for ships. And I know this because Scripps Institution of Oceanography is just looking at building a new ship, and they were just considering use of how this would affect their operations. And the next area, please, the next slide. Okay, so this brings us, the question of consumption and increasing consumption brings us to the whole discussion in the literature about the limits of transportation electrification. So first, this particular study that we chose shows the immense difficulty of decarbonizing transportation because we are so dependent on it, and we have created a system that really depends on these fuels for cars, trucks, ships, and planes. And it's also possibly the least diversified of energy end-use sectors. There's increasing demand globally for mobility, and there are technical limitations on the options to replace oil. So the IPCC has found that if we follow current trends in this, especially GHG emissions from transport will increase faster than from any other area. This study also points out that we may have reached the limits of fuel efficiency of vehicles. They say that because they say, look at the Dieselgate scandal and look at the stories they tell about fuel economy. It's not really what's written on the tag. And then we have a huge issue with equity in transportation. These are all very difficult to model. And so they're saying that the models are really unrealistic because they're using massive technological change and assumptions of future technologies like CCS, like hydrogen, which are not only relatively uncertain, but we're assuming that they will be available commercially at huge levels and sustainable levels, and that these assumptions are questionable. So this increasing body of research is showing that without very strong behavioral changes, this crisis won't go away, and the GHG emissions reductions, particularly in transportation, will be very hard to achieve. And so this particular group, Blas et al. 2020, models 4 scenarios. 3 of them are growth scenarios with all the changes we have, and 1 is a degrowth scenario. And what they find that it is only in the degrowth paradigm that we will be able to achieve the reductions we need. And the degrowth paradigm is quick and radical shift to light EVs and non-motorized modes, and a drastic reduction in total transportation demand. Next slide, please. Oh, that's it. Thank you. These are the references if you want to look at those papers.
Thank you, Dr. Silvas. And I have a couple of questions for you on, thank you for that literature review on both demand and supply side. But, you covered a vast expanse from passenger and freight mobility and the global supply chain. So I wanted to ask you, in looking at this literature review in terms of our gaps in our knowledge base, if there are case studies from outside our region that we could learn from, and kind of if there are lessons that we can adopt for our San Diego region.
There are definitely lessons we can learn for our region. I think this shared autonomous vehicles, like the e-vehicles, I actually experienced that in Berlin a few months ago. They've been experimenting with these e-vehicles. It was so easy. These e-vehicles are charged with solar during the day. And basically it's like using a zip car, but it's e-vehicles, and you just get one near your place and you drop it off near your place. They have the parking arrangements all figured out. These are urbanized areas. So I think that's, for example, one thing that we could look at doing in our urbanized areas. There's also the research into alternatives for ships and for rail. We do have a huge issue with rail that I think we really have to resolve, because otherwise we won't even have rail in our area, and we'll be moving that freight onto road trucks, which will increase our air pollution with road trucks, and also our greenhouse gas emissions, and increase traffic in areas of concern that we already have. So I think there are a couple of things that we can address urgently in the region, and other ideas we can take from outside.
Thank you. And I also want to acknowledge that you teach international law at the University of San Diego School of Law, and as we're exploring this regional model, we are also connected to in both in terms of trade as well as in terms of pollution to our borders, to neighbors to the south of us and around the world. So I wanted to ask you, in terms of regional collaboration, as we think of partnership with other players around the world and in the transportation sector, what potential role do you see the county playing in bringing everyone to the table to have this kind of discussion on regional action for decarbonization in transportation?
Yeah, so I mean, our border region is the ideal test bed, I think, for regional collaboration, but cross-border with Mexico related to the trucks. I mean, we have something like 2 million trucks crossing in every direction. I think that was in 2019. So we have that situation because we've opened up our economies, so Canada, US, and Mexico through NAFTA, but even much before that, open it up to trade, where we've been using this economic paradigm that we should produce the goods in places where it's cheaper to produce or where there's a competitive advantage and so on. And the US can sell its goods and services in those other countries. So this is the final result of this kind of an opening. And I think we need to, I mean, I agree with the last academic approach, is that we sort of have to rethink this approach to dealing with each other across the borders. But as far as the county is concerned, they could, I think, start, or maybe they already have a discussion with across the border and the transportation companies in how you can improve the efficiencies, like with sharing warehouses or finding those efficiencies, helping trucks on the other side to become more fuel efficient, for example, and figuring out those kind of interactions at a small level, not the global level. I think there are opportunities.
Thank you so much, and that concludes your presentation. We appreciate your time here.
Thank you.
Next, we will hear from Jim Messner. And Jim, I need to apologize